The war in Iran is showing no signs of letting up. Quite the opposite, actually. Israel and the US have stepped up their attacks, with President Donald Trump saying America has the capability to keep going far longer than the 4 to 5 weeks originally planned. Iran has widened its retaliation in response, attacking a number of Gulf states and the US Embassy in Saudi Arabia. The conflict has also spread to Lebanon, where Iran's ally Hezbollah says it's ready for open war with Israel.
Another missile rocks the center of Tehran, just one of dozens. The US and Israel say they have carried out large-scale strikes on Iranian military command centers, including the headquarters of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
We're not stopping, not even for a minute. The power of our attacks is unprecedented. The Iranian regime is being struck to its core. It's weakening by the day.
Iran has responded by launching drones and missiles at targets all over the region. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, anywhere with a US military presence. Now Iran has been joined by one of its most important proxies, the Hezbollah militia in Lebanon. The group has vowed to return to resistance against Israel, opening yet another front in this regional conflict. Israel has responded with strikes all across Lebanon. In the capital Beirut, an Israeli attack destroyed the headquarters of Hezbollah's Al-Noor radio station. Other targets have not been so clear.
We received an evacuation warning around 4 in the morning. The building is empty. There's nothing there except a car shop.
Israel has now launched a ground incursion into southern Lebanon, and tens of thousands of Lebanese civilians are fleeing their advance.
Our forces have taken control of the terrain and are creating a buffer between residents and any potential threat.
What began as a surprise attack on Iran by the US and Israel has quickly spiraled into a region-spanning conflict. Both the US and Israel say this will not be a long war, but with escalation after escalation, the opportunities to end it are few and far between.
Earlier, I spoke to Justin Crump. He's an intelligence expert, a British Army combat veteran, and the CEO of Sibylline, that's a security consultancy in London. With Ayatollah Ali Khamenei now dead and no clear successor, I asked whether the leadership vacuum could leave Iran even more unpredictable.
There are a lot of quite bad outcomes, I think, of that current situation. Obviously, the aspiration, I think, from the US and Israel is that removing leadership might lead either to full-on change in Iran or a environment where new leaders took over who are willing to negotiate differently. I think the reality is whatever happens will fall short of that. And the worst fears are, of course, of complete collapse in Iran, something that looks very much like Libya did. In quite similar circumstances, airstrikes being used to bring about a change of government, but without the ability to influence events strongly on the ground in a very complicated country. And Iran is a very complicated country with multiple ethnic groups, despite the way it can look from the outside. So the big fear, I think, in the Gulf region ahead of the conflict was Iran collapsing, civil strife, potentially violence throughout the Gulf region, mass movement of refugees. And of course, that poses threats to Europe as well. So a leadership vacuum in the long term, a breakup of the state of Iran in the long term, something that people are very focused on as a negative outcome, even if that at the moment is not necessarily looking likely. The fact that it is probable scares many.
Now, Iran has launched wide-ranging missile and drone attacks across the whole Gulf region. What would it actually take for a country like, say, Saudi Arabia or the UAE to move from defensive actions to joining a US-led coalition militarily?
I mean, you have to consider that if any other nation really was under the level of attack that the Gulf states are seeing at the moment, you would feel they'd be more than within their rights to engage in action against the country that was attacking them, the country that was sending missiles and drones and targeting their infrastructure and their civilians day after day, and in quite large numbers, particularly in the case of the UAE. and potentially even fomenting civil unrest in the case of Bahrain. So I think the restraint of the Gulf nations is notable. They've spent a lot of money on their armed forces for this exact scenario. And it must be getting very tempting for them to want to strike back just to show they can, they will, that they're protecting their people, that they are strong places, and they're prepared to take the sort of actions required. Now, of course, joining a war already in progress takes quite a lot of effort. The American and the Israeli plan at the moment hasn't been designed with the Gulf nations joining in offensive action in mind, or other nations joining. It can be adapted, of course, but that takes additional effort, an increased headquarters function. And obviously there is coordination on defense at the moment. How quickly that would be shift to offense is unknown. So, of course, the Gulf nations may already have made a decision that they will attack Iran, but it would take some time for that to manifest in action. And they probably wouldn't want to say that too early. And maybe they're also hoping that were they to start making more noise about it, that perhaps that would convince Iran to stop targeting them. But of course, what they really want is the whole situation to die down. And of course, they'd be afraid that offensive action would make the situation worse. There comes a point where you just can't tolerate this sort of attack anymore, and you look weak just sitting back and letting it happen. And also for those nations, the ability to defend themselves is not infinite. And there could come a point when the Iranian attacks start to achieve more damage or hit more sensitive targets like desalination plants in the Gulf, without which people have no water. That would be very dangerous indeed. So there are various trigger events, I think, that the Gulf is probably getting quite close to at this stage.
Yeah, it's also, and the damper it has put on the oil business is, of course, something they are all considering. Now, Iran's Lebanese proxy Hezbollah is already involved. How much autonomy do they and other allied groups, such as Hamas and the Houthis, have to escalate without direct orders from Tehran?
It's interesting in this set of operations now. I mean, Iran has indicated, I think credibly, that at this stage, a lot of its military deployments and incidents happening are actually being directed at a tactical or operational level, not a strategic level. Put simply, it looks like they had a plan in place before the conflict. They briefed commanders, they were given tasks, they were given missions in the event that conflict started. And of course, Iran knew this was coming. They just didn't precisely know when. And therefore, commanders really are just getting on with their missions in quite an isolated manner at the moment. And I think that extends to Iran's proxies in the region, so the Houthis in particular, and Hezbollah, who were probably given some sort of guide on how to behave once things started, on the basis that communication might be difficult, on the basis, frankly, that Iran probably expected decapitation would be early on the agenda, maybe not quite as successful and early as actually happened, but it's certainly not a new tactic for the Israelis in particular at this time. And so I think consideration was given to that. And we're seeing that manifest in the tactics, in the choice of targets to an extent, and the speed of the Iranian response, which was much quicker than during previous exchanges with Israel. They were firing back very quickly and across the Gulf at a wider range of targets from the start, which I think is also notable. So I think operational autonomy is the way that Iran is looking to survive, to keep fighting back across the region, and with that goal of creating maximum disruption, trying to bring as much pressure as possible to bear on the US in particular to effectively allow the Islamic regime to survive in Iran. That is their overwhelming objective. I think pressure will bring that about.
Now let's zoom out from the current theatre a bit. And aside from the known proxies in the area, what are the most urgent security risks the international community should be preparing for if, like analysts warn, the conflict stretches for weeks and Iran's retaliation intensifies rather than subsides?
I mean, the biggest impacts I think we'll all feel will be the continued impact on markets, even if there is not extensive damage to oil and gas infrastructure in the Gulf or extensive sinking of shipping or mining of the Strait of Hormuz or any of those other things. The uncertainty is already mounting. The costs are already mounting. Shipping companies having to make decisions already about do they route around the Cape of Good Hope. Stockpiles are building up. And it's not just about oil and gas. The Gulf actually refines a lot of the world's sugar, for example. There are other commodities going in and out. There are alternative routes for some things. That takes time to set up. using alternate pipelines. So the shocks of not just hydrocarbons, but lots of impacts emanating from war in the region will affect all of us. And it's a case of how bad those could get and whether those trigger other factors. For example, the AI boom in the US relies on cheaper energy. If energy prices are really spiking, that could curtail some of the AI development, and we know that there are risks around that. So there are cascading consequences, even without thinking about security consequences. More immediate security consequences, though, the killing of the Ayatollah obviously has upset a lot of people. That's probably an understatement. And the terrorism threat is heightened as a result of that, undoubtedly, particularly against US interests around the world. And there is a risk of more of those sorts of things happening anywhere. And in the long run, of course, if Iran collapses, you could see refugee flows, you could see destabilization across the region. Iran could even do things like try and push more into Iraq, into Bahrain, and to try and foment unrest in a lot more areas than we're seeing at present. So all of those things have direct security consequences. And in the longer term, of course, the US is potentially gambling here that if Iran is cleaned up, then they can divert resources that have been in the Middle East for decades towards the Pacific. And everything we look at, we have in mind, what does this mean for China and the US in the long term, the relationship between those powers, and potentially even therefore Russia and Europe and other players, all balancing what's happening in the Gulf. So those are long-term things we're looking at very hard.
Justin Crump, their security expert and CEO of Sibylline in London, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.